History is a story told in whispers and shouts. There are the shouts of great battles, of revolutions, of world-changing discoveries that echo loudly through the halls of time. But then, there are the whispers. The quiet, often ignored stories of the individuals who paid the price for progress, whose sacrifices became the invisible foundation upon which a safer, more just world was built. The story you are about to hear begins not with the roar of a fire or the scream of a victim, but with a sound far more mundane and far more sinister, the slow, steady drip of a leaking seam on a massive steel tank. On a cold January day in 1919, a disaster unlike any other struck the city of Boston. It was not a fire, nor an earthquake, nor a bomb. It was a wave. A 25-foot-tall, dark, sticky wave that moved faster than a running horse, killing 21 people and leveling a neighborhood. Its cause was not an act of God, but a series of chilling warnings that were deliberately and fatally ignored. This is the story of a cover-up, painted in a coat of brown, and a community's epic fight for justice against one of the most powerful corporations in America. Before we step back into this world of stark contrasts, we invite you to consider a question: what is the true cost of progress, and who is forced to pay the bill? Leave your first impression in the comments below. Act 1: The Gilded Cage. To understand the flood, one must first understand the world that built the tank. Our story begins not in the chaos of the disaster, but in the gritty, industrious, and deeply divided city of Boston in the early 20th century. It was a city of stark contrasts, a place where the old world of Yankee Brahmins, with their stately homes on Beacon Hill, collided with the new world of Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants, who crowded into the dense, vibrant tenements of the North End. The year 1915 found America perched on the edge of a world at war, though the nation would not officially join the conflict for another 2 years. The Great War raging in Europe had already begun to reshape American industry, creating unprecedented demand for materials that could support the war effort. Among these materials was industrial alcohol, a critical component in the manufacture of cordite, the smokeless powder used in artillery shells and rifle cartridges. This demand would prove to be both the catalyst for enormous profits and the seed of a tragedy that would shake Boston to its foundations. The North End in 1915 was the most densely populated neighborhood in Boston, a testament to the massive wave of immigration that had transformed the city over the previous half-century. It was a 1-square-mile peninsula of brick and wood, a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets that had been laid out in colonial times but now teemed with the life of the modern industrial age. The air was a thick concoction of salt water from the harbor, coal smoke from the chimneys of countless tenements, and the rich aromas of Italian bakeries, Jewish delicatessens, and Irish taverns that reflected the neighborhood's diverse immigrant population. The elevated train, known affectionately as the L, clattered overhead on Commercial Street, its iron structure casting moving shadows on the cobblestone streets below where children played stickball and pushcart vendors sold their wares in a dozen different languages. This was a community of working-class families, most of whom had come to America seeking the promise of a better life, but had found instead the reality of long hours and low wages in the factories and dockyards that lined the waterfront. The demographics of the North End told the story of American immigration in microcosm. The Irish, who had arrived in large numbers during the Great Famine of the 1840s, had established the first major immigrant presence in the neighborhood. They had been followed by waves of Italian immigrants, particularly from the impoverished regions of southern Italy and Sicily, who by 1915 were beginning to dominate the area's population. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, fleeing pogroms and economic hardship, had also settled in significant numbers, creating their own enclaves of synagogues, schools, and businesses along Salem Street and its adjacent thoroughfares. Each ethnic group brought its own traditions, languages, and survival strategies to the dense urban environment of the North End. Italian families often took in boarders to help pay rent, cramming extended families and strangers into apartments designed for much smaller occupancies. Jewish immigrants frequently established small businesses, tailoring shops, dry goods stores, and food markets that served both their own communities and the broader population of the neighborhood. The Irish, having arrived earlier and achieved a measure of political influence, often found work in the city's fire and police departments, as well as in the construction trades that were constantly busy in Boston's rapidly growing economy. But regardless of their ethnic background, most North End residents shared common experiences. They lived in overcrowded tenements with poor sanitation and inadequate ventilation. They worked in dangerous industrial jobs with little protection from injury or exploitation, and they struggled to save money while supporting not only their immediate families but often relatives back in Europe who depended on their remittances for survival. The tenement buildings that housed these families were architectural marvels of efficiency and exploitation. Built to maximize rental income from every square foot of valuable urban land, they rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories into the air, with narrow light courts between buildings that provided minimal ventilation and natural light. A typical North End tenement might house 20 to 30 families, with shared toilets in the hallways and no running water above the first floor. Residents carried water up multiple flights of stairs in buckets, disposed of waste in communal privies, and heated their apartments with wood or coal stoves that created constant fire hazards. Despite these harsh conditions, the North End was a vibrant community where neighbors looked out for each other, where children played in the streets under the watchful eyes of countless adults, and where the rhythms of daily life were punctuated by religious festivals, wedding celebrations, and the constant bustle of commerce. Pushcart vendors lined Hanover Street and the surrounding thoroughfares, selling everything from fresh produce to household goods, while the sounds of Italian folk songs, Irish ballads, and Jewish prayers created a rich tapestry of cultural expression. It was into this densely populated, culturally rich, economically struggling neighborhood that the Purity Distilling Company chose to locate its massive molasses storage tank. The decision was made not from any consideration of the welfare of the local residents, but purely from the cold calculations of industrial logistics and profit maximization. At the edge of this bustling neighborhood, at 529 Commercial Street, construction began in 1915 on what would become a monstrous steel structure that was a testament to the industrial might of the era and the callous disregard for human safety that characterized much of American business in the early 20th century. It was a colossal storage tank, designed to rise 50 feet into the air and span 90 feet in diameter, capable of holding over 2.3 million gallons of liquid molasses. When completed, it would loom over the surrounding tenements like a giant brown sentinel, visible from blocks away and casting its shadow over the homes and businesses of thousands of people who had no say in its construction or operation. The tank was owned by the Purity Distilling Company, but this was merely a corporate front. The real power behind the project was its parent company, United States Industrial Alcohol Corporation, or USIA, a massive corporate conglomerate that had positioned itself to profit enormously from America's growing involvement in the European War. USIA was one of the largest producers of industrial alcohol in the United States, and with the outbreak of World War I, the demand for their product had skyrocketed beyond their wildest projections. The molasses that the tank was built to store was not the sweet syrup that families might use on pancakes or in baking. This was industrial-grade blackstrap molasses, a thick, dark, viscous liquid imported in enormous quantities from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, particularly Cuba and Puerto Rico. The molasses arrived in Boston Harbor aboard cargo ships that had made the journey from the tropics, their holds filled with thousands of barrels of the sticky substance that would be pumped directly from the ships into the storage tank through a pipeline system. The primary purpose of this molasses was to be fermented into industrial alcohol, which was then used in the production of munitions. Through a complex chemical process, the sugars in the molasses were converted into ethyl alcohol, which was then further processed into cordite, the smokeless gunpowder that was essential for modern artillery and small arms ammunition. With America's entry into the Great War approaching and Allied demand for munitions reaching unprecedented levels, USIA's profits had soared along with the terrible cost of the conflict in Europe. The man placed in charge of the Boston operation was Arthur P. Gell, the treasurer and assistant manager of USIA. Gell was a man of his time and class, focused on efficiency, budgets, and timelines above all other considerations. He was an accountant by training and temperament, someone who saw the world in terms of costs and revenues, assets and liabilities, profit margins and production schedules. The war had created an urgent demand for industrial alcohol, and he was under immense pressure from his superiors to get the Boston facility constructed and operational as quickly and as cheaply as possible. The pressure on Gell was not merely professional but intensely personal. He had been given responsibility for the Boston Tank Project in 1915, and by 1917 he had little to show for it except a concrete foundation and a series of frustrating delays. His superiors at USIA were questioning his competence, and he understood that his future with the company, and indeed his entire career, depended on the successful completion of the molasses storage facility. He was a man racing against time, driven by ambition and fear in equal measure. The construction of the tank, which was finally completed in early 1916 after numerous delays and setbacks, was a study in haste and cost-cutting measures that would prove to be fatally dangerous. Every decision made during the construction process prioritized speed and economy over safety and structural integrity, creating a disaster that was not merely waiting to happen, but virtually guaranteed to occur. The engineering specifications for the tank were inadequate from the very beginning. The steel plates used for the walls were significantly thinner than accepted engineering standards required for a structure of this size and purpose. Industry standards called for steel walls that would be thick enough to withstand the enormous hydrostatic pressure created by 2.3 million gallons of liquid weighing 1.4 times as much as water. Instead, Gell ordered steel that was roughly half as thick as it should have been, a decision that saved money but created a structure that was fundamentally unsound. Moreover, the steel itself was of inferior quality, with a low manganese content that made it particularly brittle in cold weather. This was a critical flaw in a city like Boston, where winter temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing and could cause the metal to become even more fragile and prone to cracking. The steel had been produced using the open hearth process, which was common at the time but resulted in a product with inconsistent quality and unpredictable performance characteristics under stress. The rivets that held the steel plates together were also substandard, both in their material composition and in their installation. The rivets were too small for the job they were expected to perform, and many were improperly installed by workers who were rushing to meet Gell's aggressive construction timeline. The rivet holes themselves became points of weakness in the tank structure, creating stress concentrations that would eventually prove fatal. Perhaps most critically, the plans for the tank were rushed and inadequate. No consulting engineer was hired to review the design. No structural analysis was performed to ensure the tank could safely hold its intended contents. and no consideration was given to the dynamic loads that would be created by the movement of liquid within the tank as it was filled and emptied. The entire project was designed and built according to the seat of the pants engineering of Hammond Iron Works, the low-bid contractor that JEL had selected for the job. Standard engineering practice of the time demanded that any new tank be thoroughly tested before being put into service. This testing protocol involved filling the completed tank with water to check for leaks and to verify that the structure could safely withstand the pressure of being filled to capacity. The testing process typically took several weeks and was considered an essential step in ensuring the safety and reliability of industrial storage facilities. Arthur JEL decided to skip this essential safety procedure. The testing would have taken time, and time was money. Moreover, if the testing revealed structural problems, the tank would have to be repaired or even rebuilt, causing additional delays that JEL could not afford given the pressure he was under from his superiors. Instead, he ordered that the tank be filled with just 6 inches of water, a laughably inadequate test that told him nothing about the tank's ability to withstand the enormous pressures it would face when filled to capacity. When this minimal test revealed no obvious leaks, JEL pronounced the tank sound and ordered that it be put into immediate service. The first shipment of molasses was pumped into the tank even before the paint had dried on its exterior walls, beginning a pattern of operation that would prove to be both profitable and deadly. From the very first day it was filled with molasses, the great tank began to reveal its fundamental flaws. It leaked. Not just small drips that might be expected from any large storage facility, but significant streams of dark, sticky molasses that oozed from the seams between steel plates and pooled at the base of the structure. The leaks were so extensive that they became a permanent feature of the neighborhood landscape, creating a constant flow of molasses that attracted children who would bring pails and sticks to collect a free sweetener for their families. The leaking was not merely a nuisance but a clear sign that the tank was structurally unsound. The molasses was escaping through gaps in the steel plates that should have been properly sealed, indicating that the tank was unable to contain the pressure created by its contents. Any competent engineer would have recognized the leaking as a symptom of serious structural problems that required immediate attention. But the adults in the neighborhood, particularly the men who worked on the docks and in the nearby warehouses, recognized the leaking as a sign of danger. They could hear the tank groaning and rumbling, strange, deep, metallic sounds that occurred whenever the temperature changed or when the tank was being filled or emptied. These sounds were the voice of overstressed steel, the audible evidence of a structure that was being pushed beyond its design limits. The workers reported their concerns to USIA supervisors, but their warnings were dismissed or ignored. The company's attitude toward its working-class neighbors was one of contempt mixed with indifference. These were immigrants, many of whom spoke limited English, and their concerns were not taken seriously by corporate executives who lived in comfortable suburbs far from the North End. Arthur JEL's solution to the constant, embarrassing leaks was not to drain the tank and repair the structural problems that were causing them. Such a repair would have required admitting that the tank had been improperly constructed, would have cost money that he did not want to spend, and would have caused delays that he could not afford. Instead, he ordered that the tank be painted a deep, reddish-brown color that would camouflage the dark molasses streaks that ran down its sides. The paint job was completed in 1917, transforming the tank's appearance but doing nothing whatsoever to address the underlying structural problems that were making it increasingly dangerous. The paint was purely cosmetic, a cover-up designed to hide the evidence of the tank's flaws rather than fix them. The groaning, leaking, unsafe tank was now simply a brown, groaning, leaking, unsafe tank. The camouflage was complete, but the danger was greater than ever. Throughout 1917 and 1918, The tank continued to be filled and emptied on a regular basis as shiploads of molasses arrived from the Caribbean and were processed into industrial alcohol for the war effort. Each cycle of filling and emptying put additional stress on the already weakened structure, creating a process of metal fatigue that gradually weakened the tank's ability to contain its contents. The repeated loading and unloading created cyclical stresses that were particularly dangerous for a structure that had been inadequately designed from the beginning. During this period, several incidents occurred that should have served as warnings of the catastrophe to come. On at least one occasion, the tank leaked so badly that molasses flowed into the street in quantities large enough to create traffic hazards. Workers reported hearing increasingly loud groaning sounds from the tank, particularly during cold weather when the steel became more brittle. There were also reports of visible flexing in the tank walls, with some observers noting that the steel plates actually moved in and out with changes in temperature and pressure. Isaac Gonzalez, one of USIA's own employees who worked near the tank, repeatedly complained to his supervisors about the leaks and about metal flakes that were raining down from the tank's interior walls. Gonzalez was an experienced industrial worker who understood the signs of structural failure, and he was deeply concerned that the tank was becoming increasingly dangerous. His warnings were dismissed by company supervisors who accused him of being paranoid and told him to focus on his own work rather than worrying about problems that were outside his responsibility. The company's response to Gonzalez's concerns was typical of USIA's attitude toward safety issues. On 3 occasions, they brought in caulkers to attempt to seal some of the worst leaks, but these were half-hearted efforts that addressed symptoms rather than causes. The caulking was a temporary measure at best, and it did nothing to address the fundamental structural problems that were making the tank increasingly unstable. USIA's indifference to the safety concerns raised by workers and neighbors was not merely a matter of corporate callousness, though callousness certainly played a role. The company was making enormous profits from the wartime demand for industrial alcohol, and anything that interfered with production was seen as an unacceptable cost. The executives who made decisions about the tank's operation lived comfortable lives far from the North End, and they had no personal stake in the safety of the people who lived and worked in the shadow of their dangerous facility. The final, fatal sequence of events began on January 13, 1919, just 2 days before the disaster that would transform the North End into a scene of death and destruction. A ship arrived from Puerto Rico carrying 500,000 gallons of fresh molasses, which was pumped into the already nearly full tank. This new molasses was warm from its journey in the tropical climate and from sitting in the ship's heated hold during the voyage north. When the warm molasses was mixed with the colder molasses that was already in the tank, it created conditions that were perfect for fermentation. The warm molasses contained active yeast and bacteria that began to ferment the sugars, producing carbon dioxide gas that had nowhere to escape from the sealed tank. This fermentation process added a new and dangerous element to an already critical situation, creating internal pressure that the weakened tank was completely unable to withstand. At the same time, another factor was adding to the pressure building inside the tank. January 16, 1919, was the day that the 18th Amendment to the Constitution would be ratified, officially beginning the process that would lead to Prohibition 1 year later. USIA executives were acutely aware that Prohibition would dramatically reduce the legal market for beverage alcohol, and they were rushing to stockpile as much molasses as possible before the new law took effect. This rush to beat Prohibition had led to the tank being filled beyond its safe capacity, creating additional pressure on walls that were already strained beyond their design limits. The combination of overfilling, fermentation pressure, and structural weakness had created a situation that was not merely dangerous but inevitably catastrophic. The stage was set for disaster. The warnings had been ignored, the cover-up was complete, and the tank was a bomb waiting to explode. The final moments of peace for the North End were ticking away, and the people who lived and worked in the shadow of the Great Brown Tank had no idea that their world was about to be transformed by a wave of death and destruction that would become one of the most bizarre and tragic industrial disasters in American history. The workers who passed the tank on their way to jobs at the docks and warehouses had grown accustomed to its presence, accepting the constant smell of molasses and the sticky residue that seemed to coat everything in the neighborhood. The children who played in its shadow had turned the leaking molasses into a game, competing to see who could collect the most of the free sweetener. The mothers who hung laundry in nearby tenements had learned to time their washing to avoid the days when the wind carried molasses fumes into their apartments. None of them understood that they were living next to a weapon of mass destruction, a structure so fundamentally flawed that its eventual failure was not a matter of if, but when. The corporate executives who had built the tank cared more about their profit margins than about the lives of the people who were forced to live with the consequences of their negligence. The government officials who might have intervened were either unaware of the danger or unwilling to challenge a powerful corporation that was contributing to the war effort. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the nation and ultimately lead to fundamental changes in how America regulated industrial safety. The victims of that tragedy were already going about their daily lives, unaware that their time was running out and that their sacrifice would eventually help create a safer world for future generations. The Great Brown Tank stood silent in the winter air, its steel walls groaning under pressures that were building toward a catastrophic release. Inside, millions of gallons of molasses sat fermenting in the cold, creating the gas pressure that would soon turn a storage facility into an instrument of death. The cover-up was complete, the warnings had been ignored, and the countdown to disaster had begun. Act 2, The Brown Apocalypse. January 15, 1919, dawned with an unseasonable warmth that provided a welcome respite from the bitter cold that had gripped Boston for weeks. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero just days before, rose to an almost spring-like 43 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. For the residents of the North End, this unexpected thaw was a blessing that brought children out into the streets and gave adults a chance to open windows and air out apartments that had been sealed against the winter cold for months. But the warm weather that felt like a gift to the people of the North End was actually the final element in a deadly equation that had been building toward catastrophe for months. Inside the Great Molasses Tank at 529 Commercial Street, the rising temperature was accelerating the fermentation process that had been creating pressure since the arrival of the warm Puerto Rican molasses 2 days earlier. The carbon dioxide gas that was being produced by the fermenting sugars was expanding with the heat, adding to the already dangerous pressure that was straining the tank's weakened walls to their absolute limits. The morning hours of January 15th passed peacefully in the North End, with the rhythms of daily life proceeding as they had for years. Italian mothers hung laundry from fire escapes and tenement windows, taking advantage of the mild weather to dry clothes that had been accumulating during the cold snap. Jewish merchants opened their shops along Salem Street, setting out displays of goods for customers who were eager to venture outside after days of being confined indoors. Irish dock workers made their way to the waterfront, where ships waited to be loaded and unloaded in the busy harbor that was the economic heart of the neighborhood. Children played in the streets with an energy that had been suppressed by the cold weather, their voices creating a cheerful cacophony that echoed off the brick walls of the tenements. Some of the younger children made their way to the base of the molasses tank, where they engaged in the familiar game of collecting the sweet syrup that continued to leak from the structure's seams. It had become a neighborhood tradition, a small source of free sweetener for families who struggled to afford such luxuries. At the Engine 31 firehouse, Located just a few yards from the base of the molasses tank, the firefighters were enjoying a relaxed lunch break. The unseasonably warm weather had reduced the number of fire calls, which were typically more frequent during cold snaps when people overloaded their stoves and furnaces or made mistakes with heating equipment. George Lay, a 37-year-old marine engineer who was responsible for maintaining the firehouse's equipment, was eating his lunch while discussing plans for the afternoon with his colleagues. The firehouse itself was a substantial brick building that served as both a station for the Engine 31 Company and a maintenance facility for the fireboat that was moored nearby in the harbor. The men who worked there were experienced firefighters who had responded to countless emergencies throughout the North End, but none of them had any reason to suspect that the greatest emergency of their careers was building just outside their door. At the North End paving yard, located adjacent to the molasses tank, city workers were taking advantage of the mild weather to catch up on outdoor maintenance tasks that had been postponed during the recent cold spell. The paving yard was where the city stored materials and equipment used to maintain Boston's streets, and it employed dozens of workers who lived in the surrounding neighborhood. Many of these men had families in the nearby tenements, and their children often played in and around the worksite during their lunch hours. William Duffy, a 58-year-old laborer who had worked for the city for over 20 years, was enjoying a conversation with his colleagues about the unexpected warm weather. James Kenneally, another longtime city employee, was discussing plans for the weekend with his co-workers. These were men who had spent their careers in physical labor, building and maintaining the infrastructure that kept Boston functioning, and they took pride in their work and their service to the city. Just after 12:30 p.m., as the lunch hour was coming to an end and workers throughout the North End were preparing to return to their afternoon duties, the world ended with a sound that defied description. It did not begin with a boom or an explosion, but with a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Those who heard it would later struggle to find words that could convey its ominous, terrifying quality. Some compared it to the sound of a freight train bearing down on them at full speed, others to the rapid-fire chatter of machine guns that many had heard described by soldiers returning from the battlefields of France. This was the sound of rivets, hundreds of them, popping from the steel plates of the great tank in a rapid, explosive succession that created a staccato rhythm of destruction. Each rivet that failed sent a piece of metal flying through the air like a bullet, creating a deadly rain of shrapnel that struck buildings, vehicles, and anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. For a brief moment, perhaps no more than a few seconds, the entire 50-foot-tall structure seemed to lift slightly from its foundation, as if the enormous internal pressure was trying to launch the tank into the air. And then, with a violence that was absolute and instantaneous, the tank ruptured completely. The failure was total and catastrophic, with the entire structure of the tank seeming to disintegrate in a matter of seconds. The steel walls split apart along their seams, the rivets that had held them together for over 3 years finally giving up their unequal battle against the enormous forces that were tearing the structure apart. The release of pressure was like the uncorking of a giant bottle, but instead of champagne, what erupted from the destroyed tank was over 2.3 million gallons of thick, viscous molasses that had been under tremendous pressure and was now free to find its own level. The molasses erupted from the base of the tank like a volcanic explosion, creating a colossal wave that was estimated to be 25 feet high at its peak and moving at a terrifying 35 miles per hour. This was not a wave of water, which would have been deadly enough at that speed and volume. This was a dark, churning, semi-solid mass of molasses that was 40% heavier than water and had the consistency of thick mud. The wave moved with the force of a battering ram, but it also had the adhesive quality of glue, trapping everything it touched in a sticky embrace that made escape virtually impossible. The first structure to be struck by the wave was the Engine 31 firehouse, which was located directly adjacent to the base of the molasses tank. The wave hit the substantial brick building with such force that it lifted the entire structure off its foundation and pushed it toward the harbor. The building, which had been designed to withstand the normal stresses of urban life, was completely overwhelmed by the enormous hydraulic force of millions of gallons of molasses moving at highway speed. George Lay, the marine engineer who had been eating his lunch just moments before, found himself trapped beneath the wreckage of the building as it collapsed around him. The wave of molasses poured through the destroyed structure, filling every space and crevice with the thick, sticky liquid that made breathing almost impossible. Lay, pinned beneath a pool table and piano that had fallen from the upper floor of the firehouse, struggled desperately to keep his head above the rising molasses. For nearly 2 hours, Lay fought to survive, using every ounce of strength and willpower he possessed to prevent the molasses from covering his face and suffocating him. His colleagues in the fire department, who had survived the initial impact, worked frantically to reach him, digging through the wreckage while fighting against the molasses that seemed to resist their every effort. But the thick liquid made rescue work almost impossible, clinging to their tools and equipment and making every movement a struggle against its adhesive grip. Eventually, Lay's strength gave out, and he was forced to lower his head into the molasses. He drowned in the sweet, sticky substance that filled his lungs and blocked his airways, becoming the first of 21 people who would die in one of the most bizarre industrial disasters in American history. His death was not quick or merciful, but a prolonged struggle against an enemy that was both suffocating and inescapable. The wave of molasses continued its destructive path through the north end, picking up speed and momentum as it flowed away from the destroyed tank. It surged into Commercial Street, the main thoroughfare that ran along the waterfront, transforming the busy urban street into a river of brown death. The force of the wave was so great that it lifted a loaded freight truck and hurled it through the air into Boston Harbor, where it sank beneath the surface with its driver still trapped inside. The elevated railway that ran above Commercial Street, a steel structure that had been designed to support the weight of fully loaded trains, was no match for the hydraulic force of the molasses wave. The steel girders that supported the tracks were buckled and twisted like pieces of wire, their massive supports crumpled by the impact of the moving mass. A train that was approaching the area saw the destruction just in time, and the motorman was able to stop and reverse course, saving his passengers from plunging into the molasses-filled street below. For the people and animals who were caught in the street when the wave struck, there was no escape and no mercy. The molasses moved too fast for anyone to outrun, and its thick consistency made it impossible to swim through or struggle against. People were not simply knocked down by the wave, but engulfed by it, their bodies disappearing beneath the surface of the brown tide that covered everything in its path. Maria DeStasio, a 10-year-old girl who had been collecting wood chips near the tank, was standing directly in the path of the wave when it erupted from the destroyed structure. She was swept up immediately, her small body disappearing beneath tons of molasses before she even had a chance to cry out. Her brother Antonio, who was nearby, was also caught by the wave but managed to surface briefly before being thrown against a lamppost and knocked unconscious. He would survive, but would carry the physical and psychological scars of the disaster for the rest of his life. Pasquale Iantasca, another 10-year-old boy who had been playing near the tank, simply vanished when the wave struck. His father, Giuseppe, who had been watching from their apartment window just a few blocks away, saw the moment when his son disappeared beneath the brown mass. Giuseppe rushed to the scene and spent hours searching through the molasses for any sign of his child, but the thick liquid made it impossible to see or feel anything beneath its surface. It would be weeks before Pasquale's body was found, buried beneath debris in an area where the molasses had finally come to rest. The horses that were such an important part of Boston's transportation system were particularly vulnerable to the molasses wave. Unlike humans, who might have some chance of keeping their heads above the surface, horses that were knocked down by the wave found it impossible to lift their heavy heads out of the thick liquid. At the city stables near the waterfront, dozens of horses died where they stood, suffocated by the molasses that filled their stalls and rose around their bodies like quicksand. The sight of the struggling horses was one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the immediate aftermath of the disaster. Police officers were forced to shoot dozens of animals that were trapped in the molasses but still alive, putting them out of their misery when it became clear that they could not be saved. The sound of gunshots echoed across the waterfront for hours after the initial disaster, adding to the surreal and nightmarish quality of the scene. As the wave continued to spread through the North End, it picked up debris that made it even more dangerous and destructive. Splintered wood from destroyed buildings, bricks from collapsed walls, glass from shattered windows, and metal fragments from the tank itself were all swept along by the moving mass, creating a grinding, churning mixture that was like a giant meat grinder powered by millions of gallons of molasses. The Clarity family house, a three-story wooden structure that had been home to several generations of Irish immigrants, was picked up by the wave and carried more than 100 yards before being smashed against the supports of the elevated railway. Bridget Clarity, a 65-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, was crushed beneath the debris when her house collapsed around her. Her children, Martin and Stephen Clarity, and their sister Teresa, were all injured in the collapse but managed to survive the destruction of their family home. The immediate aftermath of the disaster was a scene that defied rational comprehension. An entire section of the North End had been transformed into a brown, sticky wasteland that looked more like the surface of an alien planet than part of a major American city. Buildings had been destroyed or knocked off their foundations, the elevated railway was twisted into unusable wreckage, and everything visible was covered in a thick coating of molasses that continued to ooze and drip from every surface. The molasses itself presented unique challenges for rescue workers who rushed to the scene from throughout Boston. Unlike water, which would have receded quickly after the initial flood, the molasses remained where it had settled, creating a layer that was 2 to 3 feet deep in many areas and much deeper in others. The thick consistency of the liquid made it almost impossible to move through, clinging to boots and clothing and making every step a struggle against its adhesive grip. Rescue workers found that conventional methods were useless in dealing with the molasses. Fire hoses that were designed to wash away debris simply spread the sticky substance around without removing it. Shovels and other tools became clogged with molasses and had to be constantly cleaned before they could be used again. Even walking through the affected area was dangerous, as the thick liquid could trap a person's feet and make it impossible to move without assistance. The search for survivors became a desperate race against time, made more urgent by the fact that anyone trapped beneath the molasses would suffocate within minutes if they could not keep their airways clear. Rescue workers crawled across the surface on ladders and boards, trying to distribute their weight and avoid sinking into the deadly quicksand-like substance. They worked by feel as much as by sight, probing the molasses with poles and hands in search of bodies that might be alive beneath the surface. Dr. George McGrath, the chief medical examiner for Suffolk County, arrived at the scene within hours of the disaster and was stunned by what he found. In his many years of investigating deaths in Boston, he had seen the results of fires, explosions, industrial accidents, and natural disasters, but nothing had prepared him for the surreal horror of the molasses flood. Bodies were completely coated in the dark substance, making it difficult to determine the age or gender of the victims, much less their identities. The process of recovering bodies was made even more difficult by the fact that molasses preserved them in a way that made decomposition slower but identification more challenging. Victims looked as though they had been dipped in dark paint, with their features obscured and their clothing saturated with the sticky substance. Each body had to be carefully washed with hot water and sodium bicarbonate before any attempt could be made to identify the person or determine the cause of death. As night fell on January 15th, the full magnitude of the disaster was still unknown. Rescue workers continued to search through the molasses by electric light, their efforts hampered by the increasingly cold temperature that was causing the substance to thicken and harden. What had been difficult work in the afternoon became almost impossible after dark, as the molasses took on the consistency of taffy and made movement even more difficult. The sounds of the disaster had been replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the calls of rescue workers and the occasional sound of debris shifting in the cooling molasses. The normal sounds of urban life, the clatter of the elevated train, the calls of street vendors, the laughter of children, had been replaced by a silence that was broken only by the groans of damaged buildings and the whispered prayers of people searching for missing family members. Throughout the night, families gathered at the edges of the disaster area, hoping for news of relatives who had not returned home. The North End was a close-knit community where everyone knew their neighbors, and the absence of familiar faces was quickly noticed. Parents searched for children who had been playing near the tank, wives looked for husbands who worked at the waterfront, and children waited for parents who might have been caught in the wave while walking home from work. The Boston newspapers, alerted to the disaster by police and fire officials, began to arrive at the scene in the evening hours. Reporters struggled to find words that could convey the bizarre nature of what they were witnessing. The Boston Globe described the scene as a picture that will never be forgotten by anyone who was there, while the Boston Post compared the molasses-covered landscape to a chocolate-colored sea of death. As the rescue work continued through the night and into the following day, the true scope of the tragedy began to emerge. 21 people had been killed by the wave, ranging in age from 10-year-old Maria DeStasio to 65-year-old Bridget Clougherty. More than 150 others had been injured, many of them seriously, and were being treated at hospitals throughout the city. The property damage was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, an enormous sum for 1919. But beyond the statistics lay the human cost of the disaster, measured in broken families, destroyed homes, and a community that would never be the same. The North End had lost not only buildings and businesses, but also its sense of security and trust in the institutions that were supposed to protect ordinary people from the dangers of industrial society. The molasses continued to ooze and drip from every surface in the affected area, creating a sticky coating that would persist for months. Pedestrians tracked the substance throughout Boston on their shoes and clothing, spreading it to streetcars, subway platforms, telephone booths, and countless other locations. The harbor remained discolored for months, and residents of the North End claimed that they could still smell molasses on hot summer days decades after the disaster. The immediate emergency phase of the disaster lasted for several days, as rescue workers continued to search for bodies and city officials worked to clear the most dangerous debris. But even as the rescue effort continued, questions were already being raised about how such a disaster could have occurred and who should be held responsible for the deaths and destruction. The stage was set for a legal and political battle that would stretch over years and test whether the American justice system could hold powerful corporations accountable for the consequences of their negligence. The victims of the molasses flood had paid the ultimate price for corporate greed and regulatory failure, but their sacrifice would not be in vain if it could lead to changes that would prevent such disasters in the future. Act 3. The Aftermath and the Fight for Justice. The rescue and recovery operation in the wake of the molasses flood was unlike anything Boston had ever experienced. The thick, sticky substance that covered several city blocks presented challenges that no emergency response manual had ever contemplated. Fire departments, police units, medical personnel, and volunteers from throughout the city converged on the north end, but they quickly discovered that their traditional tools and techniques were useless against an enemy that was both persistent and pervasive. The first attempts to clean up the molasses using conventional fire hoses and fresh water from the city's supply system proved to be not only ineffective but actually counterproductive. The water, instead of washing away the molasses, simply diluted it and spread it over an even wider area, creating a sticky soup that was in some ways more dangerous than the original concentrated substance. Fire hoses that were designed to blast away debris with high-pressure jets instead created a brown spray that coated everything within reach, including the rescue workers themselves. Dr. George McGrath, the chief medical examiner, quickly realized that conventional cleaning methods would have to be abandoned in favor of new approaches developed specifically for this unprecedented situation. Working with city engineers and consulting with industrial chemists, the rescue teams discovered that salt water from Boston Harbor was far more effective at breaking down the molasses than fresh water from the city's reservoirs. The salt in the seawater acted as a chemical agent that helped dissolve the sugars in the molasses, making it possible to wash the substance away rather than simply spreading it around. Fireboats from the Boston Harbor fleet were pressed into service, pumping salt water from the harbor through high-pressure hoses to gradually dissolve and remove the molasses from buildings, streets, and debris. The process was slow and labor-intensive, but it was the only method that showed any promise of actually cleaning the affected area. Even with the saltwater treatment, the cleanup operation took weeks to accomplish. Every surface in the disaster area, walls, windows, sidewalks, streetcar tracks, fire hydrants, lamp posts, and countless other urban fixtures, had to be individually scrubbed and washed to remove the persistent coating of molasses. Workers discovered that the substance had penetrated into cracks and crevices where it continued to ooze out for months, creating ongoing problems long after the initial cleanup had been declared complete. The process of recovering and identifying the victims was equally challenging and heartbreaking. The molasses had preserved the bodies in a way that prevented normal decomposition, but it also made identification extremely difficult. Each victim had to be carefully washed with hot water and cleaning solutions before their features could be seen clearly enough for family members to make positive identifications. The morgue that was established at the North Street Pier became a place of pilgrimage for families searching for missing relatives. Day after day, grieving parents, spouses, and children walked among the rows of coffins, looking for familiar faces or recognizable clothing that might help them find their loved ones. The process was made more difficult by the fact that many of the victims were recent immigrants whose families had no photographs or detailed physical descriptions to aid in identification. Some victims were not found for days or even weeks after the initial disaster. Flaminio Gallerani, a 37-year-old truck driver who had been making a delivery near the tank when it exploded, was not discovered until 11 days after the flood. His body was found buried beneath debris in an area where the molasses had formed particularly deep pools. The condition of the body, preserved but unrecognizable after its long immersion in the sticky substance, made identification possible only through personal effects and the testimony of witnesses who had seen him in the area just before the disaster. As the immediate emergency response gave way to longer-term recovery efforts, attention began to turn to the question of responsibility for the disaster. The scale of death and destruction was so enormous, and the cause so obviously related to corporate negligence, that public demands for accountability began almost immediately. United States Industrial Alcohol Corporation, the parent company of Purity Distilling, moved quickly to control the narrative surrounding the disaster. Within hours of the tank's collapse, USIA executives were meeting with their legal team to develop a strategy for avoiding legal responsibility for the deaths and destruction. The approach they settled on was both cynical and calculated to take advantage of the political fears and ethnic prejudices that were prevalent in American society during the post-war period. USIA's official position, released to the press almost immediately after the disaster, was that the tank had been destroyed by a bomb planted by anarchists or Bolsheviks. This explanation was designed to deflect blame from the company's own negligence and to tap into the widespread fear of radical political movements that was sweeping the United States in 1919. The Red Scare that followed the Russian Revolution had created an atmosphere of paranoia about communist and anarchist activities, and USIA calculated that blaming the disaster on political extremists would be more palatable to the public than admitting to corporate negligence. The anarchist theory was not entirely implausible given the political context of the time. The year 1919 was indeed marked by significant anarchist activity, including a series of mail bombings targeted at prominent government officials and business leaders. The North End was known to be home to a number of Italian immigrants with radical political views, and there had been previous incidents of political violence in Boston and other American cities. However, the anarchist explanation fell apart under even minimal scrutiny. No evidence of explosives was ever found in the wreckage of the tank, despite extensive investigation by both police and private investigators hired by USIA. The pattern of the tank's failure was entirely consistent with structural collapse due to overpressure, not with the kind of damage that would be caused by an explosive device. Moreover, witnesses to the collapse described hearing the characteristic sound of rivets popping under pressure, not the sudden blast that would be expected from a bomb explosion. But USIA was prepared to invest enormous resources in promoting the anarchist theory, hiring teams of expert witnesses and private investigators to build a case for sabotage. The company spent more than $50,000 on expert testimony alone, a vast sum for 1919, in an effort to avoid legal responsibility for the disaster. This investment in self-protection stood in stark contrast to the company's unwillingness to spend money on proper engineering and safety measures that might have prevented the disaster in the first place. The survivors of the disaster and the families of the victims were not prepared to accept USIA's attempts to evade responsibility. They had lived with the leaking, groaning tank for years, and they knew that its structural problems had been obvious to anyone who cared to look. They had seen the company's cosmetic paint job that was designed to hide the leaks rather than fix them, and they had heard the warnings that had been dismissed by corporate executives who lived far from the North End and cared nothing for the safety of their working-class neighbors. The legal challenge to USIA would be led by Hugh W. Ogden, a prominent Boston attorney who was known throughout the city as the soldier lawyer for his distinguished military service during the Civil War. Ogden was a man of impeccable reputation and considerable legal skill who had built his career on representing ordinary people against powerful interests. At the age of 75, he was still practicing law with the energy and passion of a much younger man, and he saw the Molasses Flood case as an opportunity to strike a blow for justice against corporate arrogance and negligence. The legal proceeding that Ogden would oversee was not a conventional criminal trial, but rather a civil hearing to determine damages and liability. Under Massachusetts law, the case would be decided not by a jury but by Ogden himself, acting as a court-appointed auditor with the authority to hear evidence and make binding determinations about responsibility and compensation. This legal structure actually worked in favor of the victims and their families, since it eliminated the possibility that USIA could manipulate a jury through emotional appeals to anti-immigrant prejudice or fear of radical politics. Ogden was known as a fair and intelligent jurist who would base his decision on evidence rather than politics, and the victims' attorneys were confident that the facts of the case would speak for themselves. The legal team representing the victims was led by Damon Hall, one of Boston's most respected trial lawyers, working in partnership with Dudley Dorr, whose firm would eventually become one of the city's most prestigious legal practices. Hall was known for his ability to present complex technical evidence in ways that could be understood by lay people, a skill that would be crucial in a case that involved detailed engineering testimony about steel construction and structural failure. The preparation for the legal proceeding took more than a year, as both sides gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and prepared expert testimony. Hall and his team conducted exhaustive investigations into USIA's construction practices, the company's knowledge of the tank's problems, and the warnings that had been ignored by corporate executives. They obtained internal company documents that showed Arthur Gell's cost-cutting decisions and his deliberate choice to skip essential safety testing. The hearing itself began on August 10, 1920, in a Boston courtroom that was packed with reporters, survivors, family members of victims, and curious members of the public who were fascinated by what had become one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Massachusetts history. The case would stretch over several months and involve testimony from more than 1,500 witnesses, making it one of the most thoroughly documented industrial disaster investigations ever conducted. Damon Hall's opening statement set the tone for the victim's case with a combination of factual precision and emotional appeal that left no doubt about his view of USIA's responsibility. "This was one of the worst catastrophes which has visited the city of Boston in my remembrance," Hall declared. "We have all been accustomed to make fun of cold molasses, but this experience, which occurred in the heart of Boston at noon in January 1919, taught us that cold molasses has death-dealing and destructive powers equal to the tornado or the cyclone when it is suddenly unloosed." Hall methodically presented evidence showing that the tank had been improperly designed from the beginning, constructed with substandard materials and methods, and operated despite clear signs of structural failure. He brought forward witness after witness who testified about the leaking that had been visible from the tank's first day of operation, the groaning sounds that indicated structural stress, and the complaints that had been dismissed by company officials. The most damaging testimony came from Arthur Gell himself, who was forced to admit under oath that he had no engineering training or experience, that he had never consulted with qualified engineers about the tank's design, that he had deliberately skipped essential safety testing to save time and money, and that he had ordered the tank to be painted brown specifically to hide evidence of leaking that he knew indicated structural problems. Gell's testimony revealed the extent to which the disaster had been the result of deliberate corporate decisions to prioritize profits over safety. He admitted that he had been under pressure from his superiors to complete the project quickly and cheaply, and that he had made every decision based on cost considerations rather than safety concerns. His cavalier attitude toward the warnings that had been raised by workers and neighbors showed a level of indifference to human welfare that shocked even hardened observers of corporate behavior. The engineering testimony presented by Hall's team was equally damning. Expert witnesses demonstrated that the steel used in the tank's construction was approximately half as thick as industry standards required for a structure of that size and purpose. They showed that the rivets were inadequate and improperly installed, that the design lacked any safety factors to account for dynamic loads or pressure variations, and that the tank would have been dangerous even if it had been properly constructed according to its flawed plans. USIA's defense, led by Charles Choate, one of Boston's most expensive and skilled corporate attorneys, continued to promote the anarchist theory despite the lack of any credible evidence to support it. Choate argued that for a person who had an evil purpose and the opportunity to reach the top of the tank, it would have required no more than 5 pounds of dynamite, probably less, to have accomplished everything that happened there. But Choate's arguments were undermined by the complete absence of any physical evidence of explosives and by the testimony of witnesses who described the tank's failure in terms that were entirely consistent with structural collapse. The anarchist theory became increasingly implausible as the evidence mounted that the disaster was the predictable result of corporate negligence rather than political sabotage. The hearing continued for months, with both sides presenting extensive technical testimony about steel construction, pressure calculations, and engineering standards. USIA's experts attempted to argue that the tank had been properly designed and constructed according to the standards of the time, but their testimony was systematically dismantled by the evidence of corner-cutting and cost-saving that had characterized every aspect of the project. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that this was more than just a legal proceeding about financial damages. It was a test of whether the American legal system could hold powerful corporations accountable for the consequences of their negligence, and whether the lives of working-class immigrants would be valued as highly as the profits of wealthy executives. The case also attracted national attention as one of the first major class action lawsuits in American legal history. The consolidation of 119 separate claims into a single proceeding created a legal precedent that would influence how mass tort cases would be handled for decades to come. The thorough documentation of corporate negligence and the detailed analysis of industrial safety standards would also contribute to the development of new regulatory approaches to workplace safety. On April 28, 1925, after more than 3 years of testimony and deliberation, Hugh Ogden delivered his ruling in the case that had become known as Doe versus United States Industrial Alcohol. In a decision that was both legally precise and morally clear, Ogden found USIA 100% liable for the molasses flood disaster. Ogden's written decision methodically dismantled every aspect of USIA's defense and laid out a devastating indictment of the company's negligence. He found that the tank had been improperly designed, constructed with substandard materials, inadequately tested, and operated despite clear warning signs of structural failure. He specifically rejected the anarchist theory, noting that no credible evidence had been presented to support claims of sabotage. The damages awarded by Ogden totaled over $600,000, an enormous sum for 1925 that reflected both the scale of the tragedy and the court's determination to hold USIA fully accountable for the consequences of its negligence. The money could never restore the lives that had been lost or undo the suffering that had been caused, but it provided some measure of financial security for families that had been devastated by the loss of their primary breadwinners. More importantly, Ogden's ruling established important legal precedents that would influence how industrial safety cases would be handled in the future. The decision made it clear that corporations could not escape responsibility for disasters caused by their negligence simply by claiming that the victims were politically undesirable or by promoting unfounded theories about sabotage. The impact of the molasses flood case extended far beyond the courtroom and the financial settlements that were awarded to the victims' families. The disaster and the legal proceedings that followed served as a catalyst for fundamental changes in how American society approached industrial safety and corporate accountability. The most immediate result was a complete overhaul of building codes and engineering standards throughout Massachusetts and eventually across the nation. The revelation that the molasses tank had been constructed without proper engineering oversight or safety testing led to new requirements that all major industrial structures be designed by licensed professionals, engineers and that detailed plans be filed with government agencies for review and approval. The Massachusetts legislature passed new laws requiring that all industrial storage facilities be regularly inspected by qualified engineers and that any structure showing signs of structural distress be immediately taken out of service until repairs could be made. These laws also established criminal penalties for corporate executives who knowingly operated dangerous facilities, creating personal liability that went beyond the financial damages that companies might be required to pay. The case also contributed to a broader national conversation about corporate responsibility and workers' rights that was taking place during the 1920s. The detailed documentation of USIA's negligence provided ammunition for labor leaders and progressive politicians who were arguing for stronger government regulation of industry and better protection for workers and communities. Francis Perkins, who would later become Secretary of Labor under President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the architect of much of the New Deal's labor legislation, frequently cited the molasses flood as an example of why government intervention was necessary to protect ordinary people from corporate negligence. The case became part of the intellectual foundation for the regulatory state that would emerge during the 1930s. The disaster also had lasting effects on the North End community itself. The physical damage to buildings and infrastructure was eventually repaired, but the psychological and social impact of the tragedy persisted for decades. Families who had lost loved ones carried their grief for the rest of their lives, and the entire neighborhood was forever changed by the knowledge that corporate negligence could bring death and destruction into their daily lives. The cleanup efforts that followed the disaster became a source of community pride and solidarity that helped the North End recover from the tragedy. Neighbors worked together to remove the persistent molasses residue from their homes and businesses, and the shared experience of dealing with the aftermath created bonds that lasted for generations. The molasses flood also became part of the folklore and oral history of the North End, with stories of the disaster being passed down from parents to children and grandchildren. For decades after 1919, residents of the area claimed that they could still smell molasses on hot summer days, when the substance would seep out of cracks and crevices where it had been deposited by the original flood. The scientific investigation of the disaster also contributed to advances in understanding of structural engineering and materials science. The detailed analysis of why the tank failed provided valuable insights into the behavior of steel under stress and the importance of proper design and construction techniques for large industrial structures. Modern engineering analysis of the disaster, conducted decades later using computer modeling and advanced materials science, has confirmed the conclusions reached by Hugh Ogden and the expert witnesses who testified during the 1920s hearing. The tank was indeed a disaster waiting to happen, and the tragedy could have been prevented if USIA had been willing to invest in proper engineering and safety measures. The legacy of the molasses flood extends beyond the specific changes in laws and regulations that resulted from the disaster. The case established important precedents about corporate accountability and the rights of ordinary people to be protected from industrial hazards. It demonstrated that powerful corporations could be held responsible for the consequences of their negligence, even when the victims were poor immigrants with limited political influence. The story of the molasses flood also serves as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting workers and communities from industrial hazards. While the specific type of disaster that occurred in Boston in 1919 is unlikely to be repeated, the underlying dynamic of corporate cost-cutting at the expense of safety continues to create risks in many industries and communities. The 146 people who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the 21 people who died in the molasses flood became martyrs to the cause of industrial safety and corporate accountability, Their deaths were not in vain if they helped create a world where such tragedies are less likely to occur. Today, the site where the molasses tank once stood is occupied by a public park that serves as a memorial to the victims of the disaster. A small plaque commemorates the tragedy and reminds visitors of the price that was paid for the safety regulations and corporate accountability that we now take for granted. The story of the molasses flood continues to resonate more than a century after it occurred because it illustrates fundamental questions about power, responsibility, and justice that remain relevant today. The disaster was not a natural calamity or an unavoidable accident, but the predictable result of decisions made by people who valued profits more than human life. The fight for justice that followed the disaster showed that ordinary people, working together and supported by dedicated legal advocates, could hold powerful corporations accountable for their actions. Hugh Ogden's ruling and the damages awarded to the victims' families sent a message that corporate negligence would not be tolerated and that the lives of working-class immigrants were just as valuable as those of wealthy executives. The molasses flood reminds us that progress is not inevitable and that the protections we enjoy today were won through struggle and sacrifice. The victims of the disaster paid the ultimate price for their employers' greed and society's indifference to industrial safety, but their sacrifice helped create a safer world for future generations. Their story teaches us that vigilance is the price of safety, that corporate power must be balanced by public accountability, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. The men who painted the tank brown instead of fixing its leaks thought they could hide their negligence behind a cosmetic cover-up, but the truth has a persistence of its own, and it ultimately emerged to hold them accountable for their crimes against humanity. Now that you have heard the complete story, we want to hear your final opinion in the comments. Was the disaster purely the result of corporate greed, or were there systemic failures that made such tragedies inevitable? If real stories like this, which expose the complex truths hidden behind the simple pages of history, are important to you, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications, so you never miss a chapter from the past. And don't leave just yet. Please watch our next video, already recommended for you on your screen, about another tragedy that changed the course of American industrial safety.